Ever wonder what happened to captured soldiers in ancient Rome? It wasn't mercy. It wasn't forgiveness. It was punishment designed to break the human spirit. Punishment so brutal that the memory of it still chills us today. This story begins with a man you may have heard of, Spartacus. He wasn't born into glory. He wasn't raised as a noble Roman general. He was a Thracian, captured and enslaved, forced into the gladiator school at Capua. In the arena, he learned the art of survival. But Spartacus wanted more than survival. He wanted freedom. In 73 BC, he and a small group of gladiators broke free, stealing kitchen knives and simple weapons, cutting their way out of the barracks. What began as a desperate escape turned into something Rome could never have imagined, a full-scale rebellion. Slaves poured in from the countryside. Farmers, shepherds, women, children, thousands joined him. Soon, Spartacus commanded an army strong enough to humiliate Rome itself. The Senate was outraged. Slaves weren't supposed to win battles. And yet, Spartacus and his men crushed force after force, Roman soldiers scattering in disgrace. For 2 years, the rebellion grew. Fields burned, villas were looted, and senators trembled in their marble halls. To the slaves, Spartacus was a hero. To the Romans, he was a nightmare. But no rebellion lasts forever. Rome called upon Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, to crush the uprising. Crassus wasn't a brilliant general like Julius Caesar, but he had wealth, ambition, and a hunger to prove himself. And when it came to punishment, Crassus knew how to send a message. The final battle came in 71 BC. Spartacus's army, tired and outnumbered, faced the full might of Crassus's legions. The ground shook with the clash of steel, the cries of men, the thunder of marching feet. Spartacus fought with desperate fury, cutting his way toward Crassus himself, hoping to end the battle in one stroke. But fate was cruel. Spartacus fell, surrounded, cut down with his men. The rebellion was over. But Rome's vengeance was just beginning. Here's where the horror truly begins. Crassus had captured thousands of survivors, not just men who had fought, but slaves who had believed in freedom. To Crassus, mercy was weakness. And so, he chose a punishment that would echo through history: crucifixion. 6,000 men. That's the number ancient writers give us. 6,000 captured rebels sentenced to die in the most humiliating, excruciating way Rome could invent. Crucifixion wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was a death designed to stretch into hours, even days, as the body slowly collapsed under its own weight, lungs burning, muscles tearing, blood seeping into the dirt. And Crassus didn't order these executions in secret. No, he wanted the entire world to see. Along the Appian Way, the great road that stretched from Rome to Capua, he lined the crucifixes. Mile after mile after mile, wooden crosses rose against the sky, each one bearing a broken body. Travelers who once passed through vineyards and farms now walked through a nightmare of groaning, writhing men. For 120 miles, the road became a gallery of death. Imagine it. You're a Roman citizen, riding your cart to market. The sun beats down, the air thick with the stench of sweat and blood. To your left and right, men hang in agony, their faces twisted, their lips cracked, their eyes sunken with thirst. Some beg for water, some curse Rome, some cry out for mercy. Others are already dead, their bodies picked by birds. And the further you travel, the more crosses you see. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. A silent army of the condemned, stretching beyond the horizon. For the slaves of Rome, the message was clear: never rise again. For the citizens, it was a promise: the Republic would not tolerate rebellion. And for Crassus, it was a triumph: his chance to carve his name into history with blood. But think about this from a modern perspective. Picture yourself on a road today, driving from one city to another. Now imagine every mile marked not with billboards or signs, but with human beings nailed to wood, screaming, dying, displayed like trophies of terror. That was the reality of Rome. That was how they kept order. And here's what made it even worse. Crucifixion wasn't just painful. It was shameful. In Roman culture, it was reserved for the lowest of the low. Criminals, slaves, rebels. Roman citizens were almost never crucified. They had the privilege of cleaner deaths, like beheading. But for these captured soldiers, these men who dared to fight for freedom, there would be no honor, only the slow, grinding agony of the cross. The horror of the Appian Way didn't fade quickly. For days, weeks, even months, the crucifixes stood. Bodies rotted under the sun. Families were too afraid to bury their dead, fearing punishment themselves. Travelers covered their faces with cloth to block the smell, but they couldn't block the sight. Rome had turned the road into a scar, one the world would never forget. And here's the haunting question. What does it say about a civilization that could do this? Rome gave us laws, roads, and architecture, but it also gave us this: punishment as theater, death as warning, cruelty as control. The same empire that built aqueducts to carry water could crucify thousands without blinking an eye. Marcus Crassus thought this act would make him Rome's greatest hero. And in a way, it did. He became a symbol of Roman power, the man who crushed Spartacus. But history remembers him differently too, as the man who lined a road with crosses, the man who turned victory into horror. For the men who hung there was no redemption. Their bodies became part of the landscape, their cries carried on the wind, their suffering etched into memory of all who passed by. And for centuries, people would tell the story of Spartacus and his followers, not just of their rebellion, but the brutal punishment that awaited them. The story of Spartacus is more than a rebellion. It's a reminder of how far power will go to keep control. It's about how one man's choice, Crassus's choice, created one of the most horrifying punishments in human history. And it leaves us with a chilling question. If you had been alive then, would you have stood with Spartacus, or would you have walked the Appian Way in silence, pretending not to see? This was only the beginning of the legacy of Rome's cruelty, because when it came to punishment, Rome never forgot how to make people suffer. Rome thought the death of Spartacus ended the danger, but in truth, it only marked the beginning of a new kind of fear. Because the crosses lining the Appian Way weren't just about punishing rebels. They became a weapon in Roman politics. And the consequences would haunt both the men who ordered the crucifixions and the generations who lived in their shadow. When word spread through Rome about the mass execution, people were divided. On one hand, many citizens cheered Crassus. To them, he had restored order after years of humiliation. For 2 years Rome had been mocked, its armies beaten by slaves. To the elite, this was intolerable. The crosses along the road were proof that the Republic could not be challenged. But others whispered in disgust. Even in a society accustomed to brutality, 6,000 crucifixions seemed excessive. The stench carried into towns. Merchants complained their customers stayed home rather than travel the death road. Even some senators admitted quietly that Crassus's victory was stained with cruelty. Rome had seen mass executions before, but never a spectacle on this scale. Crassus, however, believed the horror was his ticket to greatness. He strutted into the city expecting glory, parades, statues. But here was the twist. Pompey, another Roman general, had also been campaigning at the time. Pompey returned from Spain, claiming that he, not Crassus, had truly ended the rebellion by killing the final stragglers. The Senate gave Pompey more credit than Crassus. Imagine Crassus's fury. He had lined an entire highway with blood, yet Pompey walked away with the laurels. This rivalry poisoned Roman politics. Crassus and Pompey became uneasy allies, eventually joining Julius Caesar in the first triumvirate. But the memory of Spartacus never left them. Crassus wanted the world to remember him as the man who crushed the slave army. Instead, history branded him with the crosses. And yet, those crosses had a meaning far beyond politics. For Rome's lower classes, the poor, the enslaved, the powerless, the Appian Way became a silent reminder what rebellion cost. It wasn't just the death of Spartacus. It was a death of hope. Every groaning body nailed to which screamed a warning. Freedom was impossible. The Republic's grip was absolute. Still, stories spread. Mothers whispered Spartacus's name to their children, not as a rebel but as a hero. Around kitchen fires and in cramped slave quarters, the tale lived on. Spartacus became more than a man. He became a legend of resistance, and that terrified Rome even more. Because you can kill a man, you can crucify his followers, but you can't kill the idea of freedom. But let's return to the punishment itself. Crucifixion was not just death. It was torture turned into theater. Some accounts describe victims surviving for days, gasping for breath, their bodies bloated under the sun. Soldiers sometimes amused themselves by prolonging the agony, offering water laced with vinegar, or stabbing just enough to keep the man alive. Along the Appian Way, there would have been screams carried on the wind at all hours. Travelers who passed by said they could hear the dying before they could even see them. And Rome left the bodies to rot. There were no burials, no final prayers. Corpses sagged as it would crack, bones jutted, crows feasted. Imagine driving across the highways of America today. Every exit ramp filled with corpses strung to poles. That was the Republic's way of saying, we rule through fear. The punishment scarred Roman culture. Later emperors remembered Crassus's display and imitated it. Crucifixion became a tool not just for rebels, but for anyone who threatened the state. Christians in the centuries to come would meet the same fate, nailed to crosses as public warnings. When Jesus was crucified under Roman authority, the symbolism was deliberate. The same shame, the same warning Spartacus's men had endured. So what about Crassus? Did the horror make him immortal in Rome's memory? Not in the way he hoped. His wealth made him powerful, but his reputation never reached the glory of Pompey or Caesar. He remained envious, bitter, desperate for one great victory. That desperation led him east to Parthia, where he sought to outshine his rivals. Instead, he marched into disaster. At the Battle of Carrhae, his army was annihilated. Crassus himself met a grotesque end. Some say the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his greed. The man who crucified thousands died, choking on the very thing he loved most. Meanwhile, Spartacus lived on in memory. Though no historian recorded his body being found, legends claim he died fighting bravely, sword in hand, surrounded by enemies. He became the symbol of defiance, the man who dared to challenge Rome's iron grip. Plays, poems, and later novels would paint him as a tragic hero. Even centuries later, revolutionaries would cry his name as a rallying cry for the oppressed. So here's the question. Who truly won? Crassus lined the road with death, but his legacy is one of cruelty, greed, and humiliation. Spartacus lost the battle, but his spirit survived, inspiring generations long after Rome crumbled into dust. And the Appian Way? Tourists walk it even today, never knowing that beneath their feet lay the ghosts of 6,000 men who suffered one of the most brutal punishments in human history. The vineyards have returned, the fields are green, but in the silence you can almost hear the echoes, the cries of men begging for air, the whispers of families who dared not look, the call of birds feeding on condemned. Rome wanted to erase Spartacus. Instead, Rome made him eternal. By crucifying his men, they carved his rebellion into history. And by trying to bury the hope of freedom, they planted a seed that outlived the Republic itself. This is the true legacy of that punishment. It wasn't just about breaking bodies. It was about breaking spirits, about teaching a lesson in blood. And yet, the lesson didn't go as Rome intended. Because 2,000 years later, we still remember Spartacus. We still tell the story. And we still shudder at the thought of 6,000 crosses burning under the sun. That is the aftermath of Rome's cruelty. That is how power and fear tried to silence freedom, and failed. The days after the gruesome spectacle along the Appian Way were heavy with silence. The bodies of the crucified rebels stretched for miles, a stark reminder of what happened when Rome's power was challenged. But the horror did not end with their deaths. The citizens of Rome, the soldiers, and even the neighboring provinces felt the chilling message. Defiance against Rome was met not just with death, but with enduring public humiliation so brutal it carved itself into memory. Spartacus, though dead, had become a symbol. Stories of his bravery and leadership spread through whispers among slaves and soldiers alike. They spoke of how he had once commanded legions of the oppressed, how he had bested Roman forces in clever maneuvers, and how, for a brief moment, the idea of freedom had seemed possible. Yet the reality of Rome's punishment overshadowed those victories. Crassus had demonstrated, with meticulous cruelty, that rebellion was not simply defeated, it was obliterated. The political fallout was immediate. Crassus returned to Rome to a Senate that was both impressed and fearful. He was lauded for his victory, praised for restoring order, but behind the accolades lurked unease. The sight of hundreds of crucified men, their lives extinguished in public torment, was not easily forgotten. Some senators whispered that Crassus had gone too far, that the spectacle of terror might inspire future unrest rather than deter it. Yet no one dared openly oppose him. Power, after all, demanded silence in the face of such ruthless authority. Among the people, reactions were mixed. Families walked past the corpses, some clutching their children tighter, others whispering prayers for those who had fallen. Merchants and soldiers alike felt the weight of Rome's might. The crucifixion of Spartacus' men was not merely punishment. It was theater, a lesson etched into stone and blood. Mothers warned children. Soldiers remembered the cost of defiance, and the slave markets quieted under the knowledge that hope, if unguarded, could be fatal. Culturally, the event resonated far beyond the city. Rome had long used fear as a tool, but the crucifixion of hundreds along the Appian Way marked a new scale of terror. It was not just a punishment for rebellion. It was a statement about the empire itself. The message was clear. Rome could extend its reach into every corner of life, bending bodies and spirits alike to its will. Artists, poets, and chroniclers recorded the event, ensuring that history would not forget the cruelty meted out. In a twisted sense, Crassus' victory became a legend, a dark tale of power, strategy, and the devastating consequences of defiance. Yet the horror did not remain abstract. Among the survivors of surrounding skirmishes, stories emerged of the captured soldiers who had once fought alongside Spartacus. These men had been spared immediate death, but were subjected to unimaginable torment. They were paraded through towns, humiliated in front of citizens, forced to endure the taunts of soldiers who had survived the battles. Some were condemned to work in mines, their bodies slowly breaking under the weight of stone and labor, their spirits crushed to mirror the corpses that lined the Appian Way. Crassus' actions also sent ripples through Rome's military culture. Commanders noted the efficacy of terror as a tool for maintaining order. The idea of making an example out of enemies became a blueprint for future campaigns. Augustus and other leaders would later study rebellion suppression, considering not only battlefield strategy but also psychological warfare, the manipulation of fear as a weapon. The brutal punishment of Spartacus' men became a reference point, a historical lesson in both caution and cruelty. Even as decades passed, the shadows of the event lingered. Roads leading into Rome were said to be haunted by the memory of the crucified. Travelers told tales of the Appian Way's horrific display. Slaves carried the story in whispered warnings, and free men considered the cost of insurrection. The legacy of Spartacus and his defeated army was etched into the Roman consciousness, not just as a tale of rebellion, but as a chilling example of the empire's capacity for calculated horror. Historians centuries later reflected on the implications. Plutarch, Appian, and other chroniclers debated the morality of Crassus' actions, weighing military necessity against human dignity. To some, the punishment was a masterstroke, an unflinching demonstration of Roman authority. To others, it was monstrous, a stain on the legacy of the Republic. Yet all agreed, the Appian Way had become a classroom in fear, a vivid lesson on the consequences of challenging Rome. The story of Spartacus did not end in death. It endured in the hearts of the oppressed, in the cautionary tales told to soldiers, and in the strategic manuals of future generals. The rebellion may have failed, but its memory persisted. And in the minds of those who had witnessed or heard of Crassus' punishment, a single truth remained clear. To stand against Rome was to invite not just death, but a legacy of torment designed to echo across generations. Even the grandeur of Rome, the marble, the forums, the gleaming statues, could not erase the horror that road lined with crucified men. For a fleeting moment, the rebels had challenged the greatest power of the ancient world. But in doing so, they had shown everyone, alive or dead, what defiance could cost. The Appian Way became both a tomb and a testament, a monument not to the victors, but to the enduring, terrifying presence of Roman authority. And so, Spartacus lives on, not in victory, but in legend as the man who dared, even briefly, to defy an empire that measured power in both territory and terror. Crassus, for all his accolades, is remembered as the enforcer of that terror, the man whose strategic mind was matched only by the cruelty of his punishment. Their intertwined legacies are a stark reminder of a world where courage and horror walked hand in hand, and where the cost of freedom could be measured in blood, agony, and the silence of the Appian Way. The story closes with a lesson of history's harshest truths. Empires thrive not just on might, but on fear. Rebellion may inspire hope, but also risks a scale of retribution so vast it becomes legendary. And for those who dare to challenge authority, the shadows of Spartacus and Crassus remind us that sometimes survival is less about victory and more about the grim realities that follow.